Our first speaker is Elizabeth Miller from the USA. She's editor of the new radical feminist anthology, Spinning and Weaving, Radical Feminism for the 21st Century. She's a member of Feminists in Struggle, and she's founder of the Chicago Feminist Salon. Can you tell us about the book and what made you want to edit it?
The reason that I wanted to do the book was that I was having all these fantastic discussions online with radical feminists from all over the world. And I was also reading brilliant statements and just in chat and in Facebook groups, just in comments. People were saying these amazing things just in comments on social media. And I would read a comment and I would think, well, gosh, that person just wrote a short radical feminist essay. Like that person is developing theory. That's incredible. And this should be, we shouldn't lose this information. We shouldn't lose this brilliance. And I think I'm also a book person. I think books are incredibly important. And, you know, I love talking to women, but I also love to have books where ideas are collected more permanently and in a way that you can go back to them and you can read them slowly and you can mull over them. And so I thought, you know, there really hasn't been a radical feminist anthology of many different women's voices for quite a while. I mean, that was a huge thing in the 70s and 80s and even the early 90s. But there haven't been a lot of anthologies recently. And so I thought, I just had this crazy idea. I just thought, well, I'm going to just publish an anthology.
Yeah. And how did you do it? I mean, how did you get all the pieces that went into the anthology, and how did you get them into the book?
So I just started reaching out to women around the world who I knew either in person or online. I emailed them, I messaged them on social media, and I said, hey, I really like, you know, I've been watching what you say on social media. I really like, you know, the way that you express yourself. I'm going to put together this radical feminist anthology, and would you be willing to contribute to it? And so I reached out to, I think, over 100 women. And I would say about half of them wrote back and said that they were interested in contributing. And then I actually ended up with 37 different women represented in the book.
Fantastic. And how did you publish it? Did you go through a sort of mainstream publisher, or is there a way of self-publishing or publishing with a small press?
Well, from the technical point of view, I self-published. I had a company print the book, so it's print on demand. But in another sense, I have a publisher, which is Title Time Publishing, which is Ruth Barrett's publication company. She published Female Erasure and other really terrific radical feminist books. And so I had really enjoyed the Female Erasure anthology, which was focused on gender critical subjects. And so I reached out to her and I said, you know, I've never published a book before. Could you help me? Could you sort of guide me through this and help me? And she did. She was a tremendous, tremendous help to me.
That's so brilliant. How about distribution? Because I live in London and I went to Waterstones, which is apparently the biggest bookshop in Europe. It's huge on Piccadilly near Oxford Street. And they had all this just total liberal feminist nonsense, or men saying there were women publishing books about feminism. And I went around looking for radical feminist books, and they just didn't have any. They had one of Sheila Jeffrey's books in the religious section, and all the rest were out of print. When I asked, and I said, have you got Mary Daly books? And they said, yes, we have. But it's the Mary Daly who writes about going for nice country walks in Ireland. Not our Mary Daly.
Not nice, probably, but yeah.
But so how have you managed to get into shops, or is it going to be an internet thing?
Well, so I can tell you a brief little story about that. I have had the same experience with so-called feminist bookstores in the US. And in fact, there's a very famous bookstore here in Chicago called Women and Children First, which has been around for decades and decades and used to be a real feminist bookstore, and now just carries sort of liberal feminist stuff and queer theory stuff. And they have a little bit of radical feminist stuff, but actually some women here went to them a few years ago and asked them to carry Female Erasure. And they said, you should really get that on Amazon if you want it.
Wow.
And so I didn't approach them. I didn't approach any individual bookstores asking them to carry it, because the way it works actually is that when you self-publish with this company, Ingram Spark, where I self-published, they have something like 37,000 distribution channels around the world. And so when you give them your book, it's actually immediately available through all 37,000 distribution channels. So you could order it online through, you know, Target or Waterstones or Barnes and Noble or Amazon or any of 37,000 other places. It can also be published through Title Times website, but any bookstore in the world essentially has the ability to get it.
Yeah.
I didn't ask them to put it on their shelves because I didn't feel like arguing with them over, you know, how terrible these ideas were, but it can be, but any bookstore could order it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And why would women read it? Can you tell us some of the reasons why it's great?
Yeah, well, it has 37 great voices in it, 45 chapters, and I can tell you, why don't I tell you the sections of the book?
Yeah, sure, that's great.
And by the way, if people want to see the table of contents for themselves, I have a website about the book, spinningandweaving.org. So you can read quite a lot about the book there. But the sections of the book, the first section is called Foundational Radical Feminist Theory for the 21st Century. And this is where I group together chapters that are sort of basic foundational radical feminist ideas. The next section is on intersectional feminism. So it's about how radical feminism intersects, or how the oppression of women intersects with other axes of oppression, such as race. The third section is called Pornography and Prostitution as Oppression of Women. The next section is called Lesbian Radical Feminism. The section after that is Women's Sexuality as a Radical Feminist Issue. Then the next section is Online Exploitation and Oppression of Women. Then there's Transgender Politics, transgender in quotes, politics, and the men's sexual rights movement. And the final section is Radical Feminist Fiction, Poetry, Plays, Memoir, and Literary Analysis. So as you can see, my goal for the book was to cover a really, really broad swath of radical feminist topics. Although I do want to say too that I think I went about helping create the book in a very feminist way, because I didn't direct women what to write at all. These 7 categories came naturally out of what women chose to write. Yeah. So I simply reached out to people and said, you know, would you write something? If they asked for guidance, I sort of listed like very, very broad topics, like you could write about violence against women. You know, I sort of listed 10 or 12 very broad topics. But beyond that, I didn't try to guide what they wrote at all, because I really wanted their own organic voices.
Yeah.
And
I mean, one thing
I grouped it into these categories.
I think that's really fantastic. But one worry I have is, in the last about 4 or 5 years, is that because radical feminism is quite famous now because of TERF, because a lot of people have heard of radical feminists being the most vocal critiques of transgenderism. And also because it's been going on for a long time. There are many, many, many women, and probably even some men, who say they are radical feminists, but they're so disparate. Their ideas of radical feminism are just all over the place. So how did you square that circle? Or maybe that wasn't what you didn't aim to do that.
Do you mean how did I make sure that the voices really were radical feminist voices?
Just because everybody's saying they're radical feminists now because it's the thing to be. And so you could get loads of lib fems just saying, I'm a radical feminist, because it sounds good. So how did you sort that bit out?
So I did that by curating who I invited. So the man part was easy because I didn't invite any men. So check that off. That was simple. And then in terms of how I made sure that none of the voices were liberal feminist voices, it was because I had been watching and interacting with these women very closely for years. And the ones that I reached out to were people that I considered to really be behind, genuine radical feminist theory. So I don't really interact with liberal feminists very much, at least not online. I mean, obviously in real life, you can't really avoid it, but online, all of the groups and communities that I'm in are very much focused around discussing radical feminist theory.
Brilliant. Well, so I've got two questions that come from that. Like, one, what would you say radical feminism is? And I know that's quite hard to define on the spot, but you might just your sort of best definition. And secondly, a lot of young women these days are completely exasperated by the lack of answers to the sexual violence that they're subject to in their lives, because I suppose because of pornography. Is there a section that speaks directly to young women on that issue of the sexual violence?
So in terms of what radical feminism is, I would say that it's a political theory that recognizes that society is structured around patriarchy and around the oppression of women by men on the basis of our sex. And oppression includes violence against women, control of women, exploitation of women as resources to be used by men in many different ways. Compulsory heterosexuality, forced marriage, pornography and prostitution, surrogacy, all of those are ways in which women are used as resources for men. And radical feminism, I would say, is first and foremost about helping women see that, because just to see how the world really is enormously difficult, because we're sort of everything in society sort of constantly gaslights us into not seeing it or thinking it's normal or thinking it's okay. And so just helping women see, sort of help the veil fall away so that they can see how things are, and then helping women choose to liberate ourselves, both individually and collectively, from being oppressed by that structure. That would be my on-the-spot definition of radical feminism. And in terms
Right.
of speaking directly to young women, I mean, now that you say that, I sort of wish I had made a section that was explicitly directed toward young women. There are many young women represented in the book. So there are people in the book who are from their teens through their 70s, the authors. And so there are many young women who talk about those things that you asked about, like violence against women and how normalized it is, and how sort of the pornographication of violence against women is being sold to women. It's being sort of repackaged and sold as empowerment, as liberation, as sexy and fun. And so a lot of the young women in the book speak about that. But I actually think that's a brilliant idea for another anthology, is, the voices of young women, how they experience the world of patriarchy today, which is different in some ways from how it was when I was growing up.
I mean, I would think also, I mean, the things that young women have said to me is they would like some information and guidance from older women. So it's not just voices of other women, because a lot of them actually have no idea what to do. They know it's a really bad situation, but they would be, so it might be great. This might be a good format of having a range of voices, but certainly answering the questions that they have at the moment could be in your next book.
Well, actually, I mean, I think that in response to what you just said, I think the book itself is really a wonderful intergenerational conversation, because there are women in it like Tamarack Verrill from Canada, and Janice Raymond, who talk a lot about, and Anne Menashe talks about the history of lesbian organizing in the US. So there are a lot of women who were involved in the second wave of feminism who talk about how the organizing was done, what the issues were, how women interacted with each other, how they work toward liberation. And then there are also these voices of very young women and sort of everyone in between, And some of the discussion in the book is about how things have changed over the decades. So I think there is really a great intergenerational conversation in the book that is that can be eye-opening really for anyone of any age to see both the differences and the similarities. I mean, which is sort of depressing to see how little things have changed in some ways.
Yeah. I've got another question is, did you find that there are quite a few women who were radical feminists, say in the 80s or 90s, or who you think now you wouldn't classify them as radical feminists because they're pro-trans? Like, did you find in your looking, and
that's such a painful question to me.
Well, tell us.
Well, who the immediate person who came to mind, and I wouldn't say she's no longer a radical feminist, but the immediate person who came to mind is Catherine McKinnon.
Yeah.
Who was a great hero of mine for many, many years, and who wrote, some of the foundational radical feminist theory. And she now sort of has made a number of very sort of glib statements that trans women are women, and she doesn't really do a good job of explaining why she thinks that, but she has said that and sort of dismissed, when she's been asked about it, she's kind of dismissed anyone's concerns to the contrary in a very glib way. And I don't understand where this comes from with her, because of everyone in the world, I think she should be able to see that women, I mean, she sort of is one of the foundational people who said women are oppressed on the basis of our biological sex. And she's written many books demonstrating exactly that. So that is confounding to me.
Yeah, I mean, one of my good friends, not who I thought was a feminist, and we used to be feminists as far as I could see in the 80s and 90s, now is pro-trans. And when we argue, we get to the stage where she says, well, I'm just not a feminist. She doesn't even say she's a liberal feminist. She just says, these days I'm just for people's liberation, or sex, pro-sex or something, which is interesting, because it's, I think, quite a few women who might have said they were feminists in the 90s, or 80s, and now possibly not even feminists anymore. But I know Catherine McKinnon's a different example. What percentage of women do you think are like former radical feminists have changed their minds on, or are pro-trans? Are there quite a lot of them, or is it very small numbers?
I don't think so, actually. I think most women who have had good radical feminist analysis in the past, it's the type of thing where once you see it, you never really unsee it, unless, I mean, you have to work extremely hard, I think, to unsee it or to deny it. And so I haven't actually seen a lot of radical feminists deciding that they no longer believe in that political analysis. I mean, I think you should read the book because it's got these incredible voices of women saying really brilliant things. And the other thing I like about the book is that there are a number of quite famous radical feminists in it. And there are also a number of women who've never written anything for publication before. And so I think it's worth reading for both of those reasons. And the last thing I'll say is that I found this experience so wonderful and rewarding and meaningful that I've decided to start an online radical feminist journal. And so I'm going to be working on that in the coming months, and hope that women from around the world will contribute to that. The one area where I wish I could have done more is that I would have loved to have more women writing in other languages and then having their work translated. And so that's something that I hope to achieve going forward with this online journal.